For the majority of medieval peasants, the line between survival and starvation was a single, well-preserved corpse. In a brutal practice known as corpse candling, a family would place a lit candle in the hand of a deceased relative during a deep autumn freeze. If the corpse held the candle through the winter without thawing, it meant their preserved flesh could be eaten as a last resort, saving the living from starving to death. Hello and welcome. Before you close your eyes and get cozy, make sure to subscribe and like the video, and let me get you to sleep flawlessly. The change came not with a storm, but with a silence. It was a morning like any other, yet entirely different. A peasant, stepping from the low door of their wattle and daub home, would feel it immediately. The air, once soft with the damp breath of autumn, had grown sharp and still. It carried a new scent, the clean, metallic scent of ice. And there, on the brown grass by the threshold, and dusting the thatch of the roof, was the first, delicate lacework of frost. This was the signal, the final, unspoken decree from the world itself. The time for planting, for growing, for harvesting was irrefutably over. Now began the season of conserving, of holding tight. The long darkness was not yet upon them, but its herald had arrived, and every soul in the village understood the language it spoke. There was no panic in this understanding, only a deep, solemn shift in focus. The vibrant, outward energy of the summer months turned inward, toward the hearth, the storeroom, the tight-knit circle of family. The first frost meant that the window for final, frantic preparation was closing. Any lingering root vegetables still in the field, turnips, parsnips, the hardy cabbages, had to be wrestled from the hardening earth today. Not tomorrow, today. They would be carried to the storage pits or clamps, layered with straw and earth, a subterranean larder where the soil's own chill would keep them from rotting through the months ahead. The sight of the frost intensified every chore, lending it a new weight. The gathering of firewood was no longer a routine task, but a vital harvest. Deadfall from the forest's edge, gnarled branches, and bundles of dry bracken were hauled back not just for the evening's fire, but for the endless succession of fires to come. A well-stacked woodpile, growing against the side of the house, was a visible measure of comfort, of security. It was a wall against the cold. Meanwhile, the animals sensed the change. The geese became restless. The pigs fattened. Chapter 2. The Last Harvest. Storing the Autumn Bounty. The first frost was a memory now, a crisp note in the air that had settled into the bones of the land. The village turned its attention to the last harvest. This was not the frantic race of the grain harvest, but a slower, more meticulous gathering. It was a harvest of remnants, of anything the earth would still yield before it hardened into winter sleep. Every item held a potential value, a small promise against future hunger. In the orchards, the final windfall apples were collected. These were the bruised fruits, the ones overlooked in earlier pickings. They would not last in a barrel like their perfect cousins. Instead, they were sliced thinly and laid on woven racks near the hearth, where the gentle, constant heat would slowly draw out their moisture. The smell of drying apple and wood smoke was a quiet perfume of preparation. Elsewhere, in the spaces between field and forest, baskets were filled with the last of the autumn's bounty. Stubborn nuts were shaken from branches or gleaned from the leaf litter. Hardy, late-season greens were picked for a final fresh pottage. The true work, however, was in the root cellars and storage pits. This was where the summer's labor was banked, like treasure saved against a coming famine. Onions and garlic were braided into long strings, their papery skins rustling like dried leaves. They hung from the low ceilings of crofts and sheds, out of the reach of rodents. Turnips, parsnips, and cabbages were the staples. Some were packed in barrels of sand, a cool, dark environment to keep them firm. Others were placed in outdoor clamps, mounds of vegetables carefully layered with straw and then covered with a thick blanket of earth. These were nature's refrigerators, using the ground's own stable temperature to delay decay. The grain was the most precious store of all. The harvested sheaves had been threshed, the grain separated from the chaff. Now it was poured, a golden STR. Chapter 3. The Slaughter Moon. Preserving meat for the cold. The shortening days brought a difficult arithmetic. The green grass was gone. The forage that had fed the livestock through the warmer months had vanished, replaced by frost-hardened stubble. Hay and stored fodder were precious, carefully rationed for the beasts that were essential to survival. The oxen for plowing, the dairy cow for her scant winter milk, perhaps a breeding sow. But not every animal could be carried through. The surplus, the young males, the older animals faced a necessary end. This was the time of the slaughter moon. The air in the village carried a new, sharp scent mingling with the wood smoke. It was a sober time, devoid of ceremony but full of grim purpose. Nothing was wasted. The act was swift, a skilled and practical necessity. The value of the animal was now to be translated into a different form, one that could last. The fresh meat was a rare and immediate bounty, shared among the family or with neighbors in a quiet understanding of mutual need. But most of the carcass was destined for transformation. Thick slabs of flesh were packed in coarse salt, pressed into barrels where the mineral would draw out moisture and create an environment where spoilage could not take hold. Other cuts were submerged in brine, a liquid prison for bacteria. The haunches and sides deemed finest were taken to the smokehouse, a small, dark building where a fire of green wood and peat smoldered perpetually. Here, the meat would hang for days, weeks, sometimes months, in the constant, fragrant haze. The smoke did more than flavor. It coated the flesh in preservative chemicals, drying it slowly into a hardened, durable state. It became bacon, ham, smoked beef, food that could endure. Beyond the prime cuts, every other part found a use. The offal was eaten quickly or turned into puddings. Bones were cracked for their rich marrow, then boiled for days to create a thick, nutritious gelatin that would set. Chapter 4. The central hearth, heart of the home. As the world outside grew brittle and pale, the world inside contracted, drawing in around a single vital point of warmth and light. The hearth was not merely a fireplace. It was the engine of the home, its sun and its soul. During winter, it was never allowed to go out. Each morning began with the careful nurturing of the night's embers, coaxing them back to life with dry tinder and breath. Letting the fire die was more than an inconvenience. It was a minor catastrophe, a theft of precious heat, and the beginning of a difficult, cold struggle to find a flame from a neighbor. The design of the peasant home centered entirely on this feature. In the simplest dwellings, it was a flat stone hearth in the middle of the beaten earth floor, with a hole in the roof above to let the smoke escape. Everyone lived, worked, and slept in a single room, within the radius of its warmth. The smoke gathered in a dense layer under the thatch, slowly seeping out through the roof, which over time became blackened and seasoned. This smoky atmosphere preserved the timber of the roof from rot and insects, and though it stung the eyes, it was a smell synonymous with shelter. Everything revolved around its heat. The cooking pot, a large cauldron of iron or clay, hung from a lug pole over the low flames or rested on trivets in the embers. In it simmered the perpetual pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew of grains, dried peas, and whatever bits of salted meat or stored vegetables could be added. It was rarely emptied, simply replenished each day, its flavor deepening over time. Around its edges, flat oatcakes or rounds of dense bread might be propped to bake. The fire was a tool for every task. Heating water for washing, warming stones to place at the foot of a bed, drying wet woolen clothes that steamed gently on a nearby stool. The circle of light it cast defined the usable world after dusk fell. Beyond its golden reach, the corners of the Chapter 5. The warmest spot. Sleeping near the animals. The hearth's warmth was generous, but it was also finite. Its reach faded just a few feet from the stone, and the cold that filled the shadows was a living presence, seeping through cracks in the walls and rising from the earthen floor. As night deepened, the family retired not just to rest, but to seek a more profound and constant heat. The solution was a simple one, born of necessity and the unbreakable logic of survival. In many peasant homes, the dwelling was shared, not just by the human family, but by their most valuable livestock. This architectural style, known as a byre house or longhouse, placed people and animals under one long roof, separated only by a partition or a simple drain channel. On one side, the family lived by the hearth. On the other, the cow, perhaps an ox, a few sheep, or the prized sow with her piglets, would be stalled for the night. When the fire was banked for the evening, the family would retreat to their sleeping area. This was often a raised wooden platform or a simple collection of straw-filled mattresses and rough blankets. And this sleeping platform was almost always built against the very wall that divided them from the animals. The heat from the bodies of the beasts, the steady, moist breath, the radiant warmth of their bulk, would pass through the planks or wattle of the partition. It was a slow, constant, biological furnace. The smells were pungent and inescapable. The scent of damp straw, animal dung, wool, and milk hung in the still, cold air. The sounds were a part of the night's rhythm. The soft crunch of a cow chewing its cud, the rustle of a sheep settling, the grunt of a pig. There was no concept of privacy from these creatures. They were part of the household's economy, its insurance, and now its heating system. For the children, this arrangement was simply the way of the world. They fell asleep to the familiar animal sounds, bundled together for shared warmth. Chapter 6. The Peasant's Diet, Porridge, Bread, and Ale. When the world outside was stripped of color and life, the diet of the peasantry narrowed to a palette of browns and grays, a monotonous but vital thread of sustenance. The extravagant variety of summer and autumn, fresh greens, fruits, eggs, was a memory. What remained was the stored, the dried, the salted, and the fermented. The winter meal was an exercise in repetition, a daily ritual centered on the hearth and its single, simmering pot. The foundation of every day, often both morning and evening, was pottage. This was not a soup, but a thick, porridge-like stew that lingered for days on the edge of the fire. Into the cauldron went water, and the coarse, dark flour milled from barley or rye. To this base was added dried peas or beans, which swelled and softened in the long, slow cooking. A piece of salted bacon, if the household was fortunate, might be added for flavor, its fat rendering into the mix. Onions or a turnip from the storage clamp could be chopped in. The pottage was seasoned with salt, and perhaps a few wild herbs gathered in better times and dried. It was a dense, filling mass, eaten from wooden bowls with spoons. Its consistency and temperature were a kind of warmth from the inside out. Alongside the pottage was bread. The winter loaf was a dense, dark thing. It was made from the same mixed grains, often with bran and husks still within it. It could be days old, hard enough to require soaking in the pottage or ale to be edible. In some regions, bread was baked not in individual loaves but as a large, flat disk that was propped near the fire to harden, then broken into pieces as needed. It was more a utensil and a filler than a treat. And then there was the drink. Clean water from a frozen stream or a well was work to obtain, and often unappealingly cold. The universal beverage was ale. It was weak, slightly fermented, and cloudy, but it was nutritional. The process of brewing used grain. Chapter 7. The Silent Village. Life under a blanket of snow. There came a morning, often after a night of whispering against the thatch, when the world had been simplified. Opening the door required a push against a new, soft resistance. Outside, every harsh line, every dung heap and fence post, had been softened and gentled under a deep, unbroken blanket of snow. The village, once a collection of browns and grays, now existed in a world of blinding white and profound, muffled silence. The usual sounds of life were absorbed by this thick, white cover. The clatter of a bucket, the call from one doorway to another, even the barking of a dog. All fell dead in the still, cold air. The paths between homes, so well trodden in mud, vanished. Movement became a laborious act, a trudge through drifts that could reach the knee. Each journey outside was considered, purposeful, and short. To venture beyond the village towards the frozen fields or the black line of the forest was a serious undertaking, a risk of getting lost in a featureless landscape where the familiar landmarks had been erased. This silence imposed a new kind of isolation. The community, so physically close, became a series of isolated islands of smoke and warmth. Visits between households grew less frequent. The shared work of the fields was over. Now, the work was individual, interior, and quiet. Inside the homes, the pace of life slowed to match the world outside. There was spinning to do, wool to card, tools to mend, harnesses to repair. But these tasks were done at a measured pace, by the dim light from a waxed parchment window or the glow of the hearth. Conversation was sparse, saved for the long evenings. The mind turned inward, or focused on the simple, repetitive motions of hands keeping busy. For children, this silent world could be a rare playground, if the cold was not too biting. But even their play was subdued, a matter of making shapes in the snow near the doorway. Chapter 8. The Importance of Fat, Calories for Survival. The harsh arithmetic of winter was not measured in days alone, but in energy. Every motion, every breath drawn in the frigid air, every effort to keep the body's own furnace stoked, demanded fuel. In this unrelenting equation, the most precious currency was not gold, but fat. It was the dense, slow-burning fuel that could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. The lean summer diet of grains and greens gave way to a conscious pursuit of fat in all its forms. The pottage was enriched not just with a scrap of meat, but with the precious grease that cooked out of it. The drippings from roasted meat, a rare event, were carefully saved in a crock, to be used for weeks to come. A spoonful stirred into a pot of gruel, a dab spread on hard bread. It added flavor, but more importantly, it added vital calories that grain alone could not provide. Animal fat was the most prized. The thick layer of back fat from the slaughtered pig, cured into lard, was a treasure. It could be used for frying, for baking, or even eaten on its own in desperate times. The fat around the kidneys, known as suet, was valued for its ability to hold its form. It would be chopped into flour to create a dense, sustaining pastry or pudding. Nothing was discarded. The gelatin rendered from bones was a form of fat, a nourishing jelly that could coat the stomach and provide a lingering sense of fullness. Even the fats gathered from more humble sources were utilized. The skim of cream from the top of the evening's milk, though scarce in winter, was a luxury of pure fat. Nuts, for those who had them stored, were prized for their oils. Every meal was an opportunity to incorporate this essential substance. A body running on porridge alone was a body living on the edge of its reserves, constantly chilled, quick to tire. Fat acted as an internal blanket, an insulation against the cold that seeped in from the outside and the energy deficit that. Chapter 9. The Dangers of the Hearth, Risk of Fire. The hearth was a sanctuary, a giver of life in the frozen months. But like all essential things, it held a dual nature. The very element that sustained them was also their greatest domestic peril. The danger of fire was a constant, silent companion to the comfort of the flames. It hung in the air with the smoke, a threat woven into the fabric of their daily survival. The materials that surrounded the fire were an invitation to disaster. The walls of the home were often made of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with clay, straw, and dung. The roof was a thick, dry thatch of reeds or straw. Over the course of the season, the heat and smoke from the hearth slowly baked this thatch, turning it into tinder. A single spark, a single ember popped from the fire and carried by a draft into the overhead gloom, could nestle into the thatch and smolder unseen for hours. A stray gust down the smoke hole could fan it to life. The consequences of such an event were catastrophic. A thatch roof, once alight, became a roaring, uncontrollable inferno in minutes. Water was hard to come by in winter, often locked in ice. The only hope was to form a desperate bucket chain from the nearest well or stream, hacking at the ice first, but this was often a futile race against the flames. A house fire in winter was not merely the loss of a home. It was the loss of everything. The stored food, the preserved meat, the grain, the tools, the wool, the humble furniture. It was the destruction of the entire autumn's labor and the means to survive the coming months. It could mean utter ruin, forcing a family to become dependent on the charity of others or to face starvation and exposure. Because of this, the tending of the fire was an act of profound responsibility, governed by ritual and caution. The hearth was swept clean of stray debris. A spark screen of woven green rushes or a metal guard might be placed before the opening at night. Chapter 10. The community oven, a shared resource. The hearth fire was a private, guarded flame. But beyond the door of each home, another fire burned on behalf of the entire village. This was the communal oven, a domed structure of clay and stone, often housed in a separate, simple building. It stood as a testament to a different kind of warmth, not the private warmth of survival, but the shared warmth of community and careful economy. No individual peasant home could justify the fuel or retain the heat necessary to bake bread properly in its own small fireplace. The dense, slow-rising rye and barley doughs of winter required a long, steady, enveloping heat that a domestic hearth could not provide. So, the use of the communal oven was scheduled, often by tradition or the decree of the manor court. Each household would have its assigned day, perhaps once a week or every fortnight. On baking day, the fire was lit inside the oven chamber early in the morning. A substantial pile of wood, gathered from common land or contributed by the villagers, was burned down to a heap of glowing embers and intense, radiating heat. These embers would then be carefully raked out, and the interior of the clay dome would be swept clean. The stones now held the captured warmth, a dry, even heat that would last for hours. Then the prepared loaves would arrive. Women would carry their shaped dough on wooden boards or in baskets, often marked with a distinctive slash or pattern to identify their family's bread. The large, heavy rounds of dough were slid into the deep, hot cavity on a long wooden paddle. The oven door, a thick slab of wood or stone, would be sealed shut. Inside, the magic happened. The intense, residual heat transformed the dense, sour mass into a proper loaf, with a thick, hard crust that would help preserve it for days. The space around the oven became a brief, weekly hub of subdued social activity. It was a chance for news to be exchanged in low voices, for complain. Chapter 12. The First Signs. Returning birds and budding twigs. The change, when it finally began, was almost imperceptible. It did not arrive with a sudden thaw or a bold sun. It arrived first as a softening. The brutal, biting edge went out of the wind. It still carried cold, but a different cold. A damp cold that held a promise within it, rather than a finality. Then, one morning, there was a sound missing from the silence. The listener, stepping outside, would realize the profound, background hum of the hard freeze had ceased. The world was no longer holding its breath quite so tightly. And in that new stillness, another sound emerged. The drip of water from the thatch. A steady, slow percussion on the ground below. It was the first music of the new year. Eyes, weary of staring at monochrome landscapes, began to search for clues. A patch of dark earth might appear around the base of a tree where the snow had shrunk back. Then, a flash of color. A startling, bold robin, perhaps, hopping in the mud. This arrival was an event. It was a messenger. A tiny, feathered guarantee that life was in motion somewhere beyond the frozen horizon. Soon, others would follow, their calls tentative at first, then growing more confident. The search moved to the trees and hedgerows. Fingertips would gently probe the ends of twigs, feeling for a subtle change. The hard, sealed bud of winter would show a hint of swell, a faint stickiness, a suggestion of green waiting beneath a brown scale. These signs were not dramatic. They were whispers, but to a community that had been listening to silence for months, they were shouts of hope. A new, earthy scent began to lift from the ground as the snow receded. The smell of damp soil and rotting leaves, a fertile smell. The days were now visibly longer. The light at supper time was a pale gold, not the deep gray of midwinter. Work began to shift, almost unconsciously. Thoughts turned, not to the management of stores, but to their inspection. Oh. Chapter 11. Waiting for spring. The psychological toll. The deepest part of winter was not measured in weeks of snow, but in the slow, heavy passage of unchanging days. The initial rush of preparation was a memory. The careful rationing of stores was now a monotonous routine. The world had contracted to the dim interior of the home, the short trek to the animal stall, the well, or the woodpile. This was the season of waiting, and its wait was as much psychological as it was physical. The silence outside was matched by a stillness within. The lack of sunlight, the weak, gray light that barely seemed to crest the horizon before fading, had a tangible effect. Energy waned. The mind, deprived of new stimuli, of distant horizons and varied labor, turned inward or grew dull. There were few markers of time's passage. One day was much like the last. The same pottage, the same chores by the hearth, the same faces in the same smoky light. The great festivals of Christmas and Candlemas were past, their modest cheer a fading memory. Now, there was only the long, blank stretch toward a spring that felt like a story, not a certainty. This monotony bred a low, persistent anxiety. It was a quiet companion to the cold. Every cough from a child was listened to with deep fear. Every measurement of the grain sack or the salt barrel was a calculation of dwindling safety. The mind would fixate on small sounds, the wind worrying a loose shutter, a strange noise from the livestock. Sleep could be difficult, not from discomfort alone, but from a form of vigilance, a listening for trouble in the deep night. Dreams might be vivid, often of summer fields or bursting orchards, making the waking world seem even bleaker. This was not madness, but a kind of wintering of the spirit. Patience was not a virtue here. It was the only possible state. Stories told by the fire grew longer, more intricate, as if to fill the emptiness of time. Hands were kept busy with the most minute, repetitive tasks. Chapter 14. The Endless Cycle, Winter in the Blood. There was no final, triumphant day when winter was declared over. No moment when the last chill was banished. Instead, its departure was a gradual retreat, a softening of the world's edges that allowed the insistent pulse of spring to grow stronger. But as life quickened, the recent winter did not vanish. It had done its work too thoroughly for that. It settled, instead, into a different form. It became a part of them, a season not just of the year but of the spirit. You could see it in their movements, the careful conservation of effort, the considered pace of a walk, the way they examined the sky not for beauty but for information. These were winter's lessons, etched into posture and glance. The stories told at the end of a spring planting day would still be the long, intricate tales spun by the fireside, stories of endurance and hidden magic. The memory of the cold lived in their respect for the larder. A good summer was not just a time of plenty, but a time of replenishing the fortress against the future. The sight of a full grain sack brought a quiet, deep satisfaction that went beyond its immediate use. It was a monument to foresight, a bulwark against the memory of an empty belly in February. The scent of wood smoke, even on a warm evening, carried with it the ghost of the hearth's necessity. Winter became the silent measure against which all other seasons were weighed. The lush heat of summer was not just warmth, but stored sunlight to be banked for later. The frantic harvest of autumn was not an end, but a beginning, the first and most crucial step into the coming quiet. Their calendar was a circle, not a line, and the darkest quarter of that circle gave shape and meaning to the light. For the rest of their lives, they would carry a certain light in their eyes when they looked upon a well-stacked woodpile, a well-made cloak, a well-sealed wall. It was the light of recognition. They understood the value. Chapter 13. The Lesson of the Medieval Winter, Resilience and Preparation. The thaw, once begun, was a slow unraveling of the world's tight grip. Mud returned, a deep, sucking morass that was its own kind of trial. But it was a living mud, smelling of earth and promise, not the sterile hardness of iron-bound frost. As the last gray ridges of snow retreated into the shadows of stone walls and dense thickets, the experience of the winter just past began to settle into memory, not as a single event, but as a deep, learned rhythm in the blood and bone of the people. The lesson of the medieval winter was not one of heroic conquest over nature, but of humble, patient integration with its most unforgiving cycle. It taught that survival was not a moment of courage, but a long season of diligence. Every action taken in the bright days of autumn, the stacking of wood, the salting of meat, the mending of a roof, was a word in a silent prayer offered against the coming dark. The winter proved the truth of that prayer. It taught the profound value of what was ordinary. A well-made cloak, a stout pair of boots, a sharp axe, a full woodpile. These were not possessions but lifelines. It taught the economics of energy, the precise value of a calorie stored in fat or grain. It taught the quiet strength found in repetition, the daily stirring of the pottage, the nightly banking of the fire, small rituals that built a wall against chaos. This knowledge bred a resilience that was both physical and spiritual. It was a resilience built on acceptance, not defiance. They did not expect the winter to be mild. They expected it to be winter. Their success was measured not in comfort, but in continuation. The simple fact of emerging on the other side, with enough seed to plant and enough strength to lift a plow, was victory enough. And so, as the first green tinged the fields and the sun gained authority, the memory of the cold did not fade. It was carried forward. It would inform every. Chapter 15. The Forgotten Refuge. The Forest in Deep Winter. When the village lay buried and silent under its blanket of snow, the forest did not sleep. Transformed. For the medieval peasant, the dense woods at the edge of the cleared fields were a place of mystery and peril, the realm of wolves and outlaws. But in the deepest grip of winter, this fearsome borderland could also become a reluctant and vital refuge, a stark pantry where the rules of the village softened into the harder laws of survival. Venturing into the winter forest was an act of necessity, not choice. It was undertaken when the stores grew thin, or when a particular need could not be met within the confines of home. The world beneath the evergreen canopy was a different one. The snow lay in uneven drifts, sculpted by roots and fallen logs. The silence here was not soft, but profound and watchful, broken only by the sudden crack of a freezing branch or the distant, haunting call of a raven. Here, the careful seeker could find what the fields could not offer. Deadfall wood, seasoned and dry, could be gathered where it lay sheltered from the worst wet. Certain barks, like willow, could be stripped for their medicinal properties to ease a winter cough. With great skill and greater luck, a man might read the fresh tracks in the snow, the delicate stitch of a hare, the pad of a deer, and turn a hunt into a miraculous windfall of fresh meat and precious fur. For the truly desperate, the forest held darker sustenance. The inner layer of pine bark, the cambium, could be scraped away, dried, and pounded into a bitter, fibrous flour to stretch the last of the grain. Lichen scraped from north-facing rocks could be boiled into a thin, gelatinous soup. These were starvation foods, causing bellyaches and worse, but they contained just enough sustenance to keep life flickering for another day, another week. The winter forest was neither friend nor enemy. It was simply indifferent, a system of ancient horrors. Chapter 16. The Sound of Iron. The Smithy's Forge. In a world muffled by snow and stillness, one sound stood apart, carrying farther on the cold, dense air than any other. It was not the soft crunch of a footstep or the lowing of a cow, but the clear, rhythmic ring of iron on iron. This was the sound of the smithy, and in the depth of winter, the blacksmith's forge became more than a workshop. It was a beacon of elemental power and a hub of quiet industry. While other fires were kept low to conserve fuel, the smith's fire was a roaring heart of flame, fed by a bellows that breathed like a great, tired beast. The glow from its open door painted the surrounding snow a flickering orange, a defiant pool of light and heat in the monochrome day. Men would find reasons to visit, drawn by the warmth that was otherwise impossible to attain. They would linger, not idle, but with purpose, watching, waiting, or bringing a tool that had finally broken under the strain of cold. For the blacksmith, winter was a season of repair, not creation. The great seasonal labors of harvest and planting were over. Now came the careful assessment of what had been worn down. A plowshare that had struck a hidden stone. An axe head worked loose from its haft. A hinge pulled from a rotting door. These were brought to the anvil, examined in the fierce light, and judged. Some could be mended with heat and hammer, the metal made pliant and willing again under his skilled blows. Others were set aside, their iron to be saved and eventually melted down, for nothing was wasted. The process was a mesmerizing dance of necessity. The damaged metal was plunged into the coals until it glowed a molten cherry red. Lifted with tongs, it was placed on the anvil's horn, and with strikes that sent sparks skittering across the packed earth floor like angry fireflies, the smith would beat the memory of its failure out of it, reshaping it to its original purpose. Finally, with a hiss that sent up a great plume o. Chapter 17. The Ice Harvest. A new and brittle road. When the cold reached its most profound and stable depth, the world's waterways did not simply freeze. They transformed into a new, alien landscape. Rivers and ponds became plains of milky, opaque glass. This was not merely a barrier, but an opportunity. The deepest freeze birthed a season of treacherous travel and unexpected harvest. The ice itself became a commodity. For those with the means and need, clear, thick blocks could be cut from the purest parts of a frozen pond using special saws and axes. These blocks were hauled on sleds to ice houses, pits or insulated sheds packed with straw, where they would be stored, remarkably, into the summer months, a luxury for preserving food or cooling drinks for the lord of the manor. For the common folk, the ice was a more immediate tool. Chunks were hauled home to melt for water, saving the labor of breaking the ice at the well each day, or stored in cold corners to keep dairy goods from souring. More significantly, the frozen river became a highway. The deep ruts and bottomless mud of the summer roads were forgotten. Now, a path of startling smoothness stretched between settlements. Goods that were too heavy for mired carts in warmer months could be slid with relative ease on sledges. News traveled faster. A journey that was a day's difficult trek in November could become a few hours' brisk, skidding walk in January. This connectedness was double-edged. It meant news of plenty or plague could arrive more swiftly. It also meant that the threat of wolves or bandits could move just as fast along these open, exposed roads. This new landscape demanded a new kind of caution. Not all ice was created equal. It whispered its weakness in cracks and groans. Areas near milling wheels, where water churned slightly beneath, or where a spring fed into a pond, could be deceptively thin. A dark patch in the otherwise white surface often signaled dangerous weakness. The knowledge. Chapter 18. The Winter Sickness. Remedies from the barren earth. The cold was a force that worked its way inward. It seeped through cracks and clothing, settling deep in the chest and bones. Winter was not only a season of scarcity for the larder, but also for the body's vitality. Sickness in these months carried a sharper fear. A summer fever could be endured. A winter cough could be a death sentence, especially for the very old and the very young, their warmth already so fragile. The signs were familiar and dreadful. The rattle in the chest that no fire seemed to reach. The heat of a fever burning against icy skin. The joints swollen and aching as if filled with the same frost that lined the trees. With the roads often impassable and the local wise woman or barber surgeon perhaps days away, families fell back on the oldest of pharmacies. The stores gathered in kinder seasons and the few, hardy things that could still be found. The hearth became a medicinal station. A pot of water steamed with thrown-in handfuls of dried herbs. Thyme for the cough, chamomile to calm a fretful child, sage to soothe a sore throat. These were treasures from the summer garden, hung in bundles from the rafters, now carefully rationed. Onions, a staple of the storage pit, were sliced and placed by the sickbed. Their pungent vapors were believed to clear the head and lungs. A poultice of crushed mustard seed or boiled cabbage leaves might be applied to the chest, a fierce, burning counterirritant to draw out the deep chill. For pain, there was the gentle, numbing tea made from willow bark, a precursor to the salicylic acid in aspirin. For wounds that festered, despite the cold, honey, if any remained, could be used as an antiseptic dressing. Strong, hot ale, infused with ginger or ground pepper, was a cure-all, meant to drive the cold out through sweat. But often, the remedies were as much spiritual as physical. A charm might be spoken, a verse repeated, a smooth, cold stone, perhaps. Chapter 19. The Silent Feast. Christmastide in the hall. In the very heart of the darkness, the calendar mandated a pause. Christmastide arrived, 12 days that stretched from the solstice toward the new year. For the peasant in their smoky home, it was a modest expansion of the pottage, perhaps with a shred of precious salted pork. But up at the manor house, in the stone-built hall of the Lord, the winter was confronted with a different kind of fire. the fire of a managed, theatrical abundance. The great hall, usually a drafty, echoing space, was transformed. Fresh rushes, strewn over the floor, released a sweet, grassy scent that briefly masked the everyday smells of dogs and damp wool. Every torch in its iron sconce was lit, and the enormous hearth roared with a fire so large it was an event in itself, casting dancing shadows up to the blackened beams. This was light and heat as a display of power, a defiance of the natural order. Here the Lord held his silent feast. Silent not for lack of noise. There would be minstrels, the clatter of trenchers, the bark of hounds. But because the true language of the feast was not spoken. It was a language of display. The food was its primary text. Meats that had been preserved for this very moment were brought forth. Roasted joints glistening with fat, pies whose crusts hid treasures of dried fruit and spiced meat, great wheels of cheese. The bread was made from the finest, whitest flour, a substance most of those gathered would never taste in their own homes. Ale flowed, not the weak daily drink, but strong, spiced wassail. For the invited tenants and villagers, this was a complex exchange. They received a meal of startling richness, a temporary immersion in a world of plenty that was not their own. In return, they offered their presence, their labor for the coming year made visible, and their acknowledgement of the Lord's authority. It was a ritual of reciprocity, but one weighted heavily in one direction. The feast. Chapter 21. The final measure. Lent and the last of the stores. As the grip of winter truly began to loosen, the calendar and the larder converged in a time of profound austerity. The Christian season of Lent arrived, a 40-day period of fasting and penance before Easter. For the medieval peasant, this religious observance found a stark, practical echo in the state of their winter stores. Abstinence was not merely a spiritual exercise, it was an economic necessity. The careful piles in the storeroom had visibly dwindled. The last of the salt meat was now a scrap of rind, its flavor boiled out long ago. The grain in the barrel was measured not by its fullness, but by the depth of the empty space above it. The root vegetables from the clamps were soft, sprouting, or spoiled at the core. This was the time of the hungry gap, the long stretch between the exhaustion of the old stores and the arrival of the new growth. The Lenten fast, which forbade meat, dairy, and fats, mirrored the scarcity with an almost uncanny precision. What might have been a sacrifice in a time of plenty was now simply a reflection of reality. The pottage grew thinner, its base now little more than water, coarse bran, and the last withered peas or beans. The bread, made from the tailings of the grain, was dark as earth and hard as stone. Ale might be the only sustenance with any strength left in it. This convergence of ritual and necessity created a season of profound, quiet endurance. Hunger was a constant, low companion. The body, already worn thin by the long cold, now ran on the dregs of its reserves. Work in the preparing fields was slower, more deliberate. The promise of spring was visible in the budding hedgerows, but it was not yet edible. They were living on the memory of food. Yet, this period was also a final, powerful discipline. It was a collective tightening of belts, a shared experience of want that reinforced community bonds. The fast was a reminder that survival was not. Chapter 20. The thaw's treachery. Spring's first threat. The promise of spring was not a gentle return, but a slow, wet siege. The thaw, so longed for, revealed itself as a season of new and insidious dangers. The world did not simply grow warmer. It first grew unstable. The firm, reliable surfaces of winter dissolved into a treacherous, shifting landscape of mud and hidden cold. The snow, in retreat, did not vanish. It melted by day, only for the water to refreeze into a skin of black, glassy ice each night. Paths became perilous slides. A simple walk to the well or the byre required a new kind of care, each step testing the ground. More frightening was the state of the waterways. The river ice, once a solid plain, began to groan and shift. It rotted from within, turning honeycombed and weak. What had been a highway became a deadly trap, prone to collapse underfoot without warning. Inside the homes, the thaw brought its own miseries. The thatched roofs, frozen solid for months, began to drip incessantly. The sound was a constant, damp percussion. The earthen floors, hardened by cold, turned to a chill, sticky muck near the door. The warmth that did arrive was a damp warmth, far more penetrating than the dry cold. It seeped into woolens, making them heavy and clammy. It drew mildew from the walls. The very air felt thick and wet, carrying the raw, decaying smell of the uncovered earth. This damp was the enemy of health. Colds that had been held at bay by the dry cold now took hold with wet, rattling coughs. It settled deeper into joints. For the elderly, this transition was often the cruelest test, the damp cold finding the weaknesses the dry cold could not reach. And for the stores, this was a time of critical danger. The root vegetables in their clamps, the grain in its barrels, were now vulnerable to rot and mold in the damp air. Everything had to be checked, turned, aired. A single spoiled cache could mean the difference between comfortable survival and... Chapter 22. The Unseen Guest, Solitude and the Long Night. The deepest cold did more than still the village and freeze the river. It carved out spaces of profound solitude that were rare in the tightly knit, communal life of the medieval world. The long nights, lasting 14-15 hours or more, were not merely a lack of light, but an expansion of interior space. With the fire banked and the family asleep, an individual could find themselves alone with the silence in a way that was almost unknown in the bustling days of summer. This solitude was a formidable presence. It was not the peaceful quiet of choice, but the heavy, watchful quiet of isolation enforced by the elements. The mind, stripped of daytime distractions, would turn inward. It might wander the well-trodden paths of memory, the warmth of a past summer, the face of a lost loved one. It might fret over unspoken fears, the cough of a child, the depth of the grain, the strength of the thatch against the next storm. In the absolute dark, the sound of one's own heartbeat could become a drum, the creak of the settling house a looming footstep. For the elderly or the widowed, this solitude could stretch for days if the snows were deep. Their world shrank to the circumference of a single hearth. The simple, monumental tasks of fetching fuel and water became exhausting trials. Their solitude was laced with a practical vulnerability, a knowledge that help was a shouted plea away, but a plea that might not carry through the muffling snow. Yet, within this enforced aloneness, there could also be a kind of clarity. The petty grievances of communal living faded against the monumental backdrop of the winter night. Priorities distilled themselves to the essential: warmth, sustenance, the health of the flock. In the silence, a person could hear the shape of their own thoughts, uninterrupted. For the spiritually inclined, it was a time for long, unstructured prayer, a direct and unmediated conversation with God. Chapter 23. The Keeper of the Flame. The Hearth-tender's Vigil. Within the rhythm of the winter household, one unspoken role carried a weight of quiet sovereignty. This was the hearth-tender, often the eldest woman of the home, though sometimes a watchful child or an elder no longer fit for hard labor. Theirs was the guardianship of the perpetual flame, a duty that transformed the simple act of minding the fire into a sacred, unsung office. The hearth-tender's day began in the deep blue gloom before dawn, while others still slept in their clustered warmth. Moving with a practiced quiet, they would approach the hearth. The night's fire was never dead, only sleeping, a bed of deep, pulsating embers beneath a blanket of white ash. With hands that knew the feel of heat and the draft of the flue, they would gently part this ash, exposing the glowing heart beneath. A handful of dry tinder birch bark, a bird's abandoned nest, was placed with care, followed by the smallest, driest sticks. Then, leaning close, they would blow a soft, steady stream of breath, coaxing a tiny tongue of flame into being. It was an act of creation, repeated every morning of the winter world. Their watch continued through the day. They knew the personality of each piece of wood, the quick, bright burn of birch, the slow, enduring heat of oak. They arranged the logs not just for heat, but for the cooking pot's needs. A fierce flame for a rapid boil, a bed of coals for the long simmer. They managed the precious resource, ensuring no wood was wasted in a careless blaze. They were the first to notice the dangerous spark that leapt toward the thatch, the first to smother it with a wet rag. At night, when the last tasks were done, they performed the final rite, banking the fire. The embers were gathered into a tight mound, covered with a special, slow-burning peat or a dense piece of green wood, and then blanketed in a deep layer of ash. This was an act of faith, entrusting the life of the flame to teach. Chapter 24. The Language of Wool. Spinning the long night away, when the world outside offered no labor, and the light was too poor for fine work, hands still had to move. Idleness was the enemy of warmth and morale alike. And so, in the dim, smoky light of the hearth, the women of the household turned to the most elemental of winter tasks, the spinning of wool. This was not a hurried chore, but the slow, rhythmic consumption of the long night itself, transformed into something useful. The tools were simple, ancient. The distaff, a long stick tucked under the arm or clamped in a belt, held the cloud of raw, washed wool, the fleece shorn last spring now waiting. In the other hand, the drop spindle, a weighted whirl of wood or stone, dangled and spun. The fingers of the free hand would draw out a thread from the wool on the distaff, feeding it, thinning it, as the twist from the falling spindle traveled up its length, binding the fibers into a strong, continuous yarn. The motion was hypnotic. Reach, draw, spin, wind. Reach, draw, spin, wind. This was the true language of winter. It had no words, only the soft whisper of fiber against fiber, the occasional creak of the spindle, the gentle thud as the spindle was wound up and dropped again. It was a conversation between the spinner and the material, a meditation in wool. A good spinner could do it almost without light, by touch alone, her thoughts wandering while her hands performed their ancient dance. This work was the foundation of everything. The yarn spun in winter would be woven into cloth in spring, cut and sewn into garments for the coming year. It was the family's insulation against future winters. The rhythm of the spinning was the rhythm of foresight, of transforming the raw bounty of the past spring into future security, one endless thread at a time. As the spindle twirled and the yarn grew, so too did a quiet sense of accomplishment. The pile of raw wool diminished. The ball of finished yarn swelled. Chapter 25. The Memory of Summer. Preserved light in a jar. Amidst the gray and brown of the winter world, one small, startling treasure might be brought forth on a particularly bleak day, or saved for a moment of low spirits. This was not a food, but a captured memory. A jar of preserved summer light. For those with the knowledge and a little luck, the golden essence of sun-warmed days could be trapped and saved in the form of honey. Honey was a substance of near magic. It did not spoil. It needed no smoking, no salting. It sat in its crock, a dense, amber pool, holding within it the scent of clover and lime blossoms, of meadows now buried under snow. To taste it was a profound shock to the senses. A burst of concentrated sweetness in a season defined by savory porridge and sour ale. It was a direct sensory line to the time of abundance. Its uses were both practical and deeply comforting. A small spoonful stirred into a cup of hot herbal tea could soothe a raw throat better than any other remedy. Spread thinly on a piece of hard bread, it transformed the staple into a fleeting treat. For a child burning with fever, it might be the only thing they would willingly take, its sweetness a gentle persuasion. It was energy in its purest, most palatable form, a quick fortification for a body worn down by cold. But more than its utility, honey served as a talisman. To lift the lid of the honey crock was to release a ghost of summer into the dim air. The act was ceremonial. It spoke of foresight, of having had the wit to rob the flowers of their sunlit labor and save it for the dark time. It was a reminder that the frozen world outside was not permanent, that the buzzing industry of bees and the riot of color in the meadows was not a dream, but a dormant truth. In a season where every other taste was of salt, smoke, or fermentation, honey was a clean, bright note. It was hope made edible, a promise that the sun had not abandoned the world, but had simply left this gold. Chapter 26. The Sound of Water Returning. The drip and the flow. For weeks, the only water was a solid, silent thing. It was ice in the bucket, frost on the thatch, snow waiting to be melted. Then came the day when the world began to speak in water again. It started as a single, solitary drip. Then another, a slow, steady percussion from the eaves that marked a new phase in the siege of winter. This was the music of the thaw, a sound more welcome than any minstrel's song. Each drop was a note in a melody of softening, of release. Soon, the drips multiplied, becoming a steady patter, a gentle rain falling from the roof's own melted snow. The sound was everywhere, from the edge of the woodshed, from the great bare limbs of the oak by the path. It filled the air with a soft, continuous chatter. Then came the rush, the sound of moving water, unseen but heard. Beneath the thinning ice of the stream, a low gurgle emerged, a hidden throat clearing. In the ditches along the lanes, dark water began to run, finding its old courses, carving through the slush. The sound was more powerful than the drip. It was the sound of motion returning to a paralyzed world, of pathways being rediscovered. For the listener inside the home, these sounds worked a subtle magic. The constant, white silence of deep winter was broken. The world was no longer holding its breath. It was sighing, streaming, coming awake. The drip and flow were a clock, measuring the sun's growing strength far more reliably than any hourglass. They signaled that the time for purely inward vigilance was ending. Soon would come the time to check the boat, to clear the drainage ditches, to listen for the sound of the mill wheel turning once more. But this new sound also brought a new note of caution. The beautiful rush of water in the ditch could become a flood if the thaw was too quick. The freeing of the stream meant the ford was no longer a solid crossing, but a cold, treacherous current. The return of the liquid. Chapter 27. The mending time. Repairing the fabric of life. Winter was the season when things broke. Cold made wood brittle, metal snapped under unusual stress, and leather cracked. The frantic pace of harvest and preparation was over, replaced by a slower, more deliberate rhythm. This was the mending time. It was not about creation, but about restoration, the careful work of making whole what had been worn down or broken, using the quiet hours the frozen world imposed. In the dim, firelit space, hands turned to these tasks. A snapped plow handle was not discarded. The broken ends were carefully trimmed. A new piece of seasoned wood selected, and the two joined with a carved scarf joint, bound tight with wet rawhide that would shrink and harden into an iron-like grip. A torn woolen tunic was spread across a knee. A bone needle, threaded with yarn spun during these very nights, would begin its journey, stitching the rent closed with tiny, invisible stitches, reinforcing a weak seam before it failed. This work required a deep, intimate knowledge of materials. It required knowing how to pare leather so it would lace smoothly, how to select a patch for a pot that would expand with the same rhythm as the original metal when heated. It was silent, patient work, often done by the oldest members of the household, whose eyes were too poor for fieldwork but whose fingers held lifetimes of tactile wisdom. There was a philosophy in this mending. Nothing was thrown away if its essence remained. A worn-out scythe blade could be reforged into two knife blades. A threadbare cloak could be cut down for a child, its last good pieces saved for patches. This was not poverty but a profound practicality, a recognition that resources were finite and had to be cycled endlessly. The act of mending was also an act of hope. To repair a tool was to bet on a future where it would be needed again for the spring planting for the next harvest. To darn a sock was to assume there would be a. Chapter 28. The sentinel trees. The forest's winter keepers. Beyond the cleared fields, the forest stood as it always had, a dark wall against the sky. In summer, it was a place of shadowed green, of foraging and fear. In winter, stripped bare, its true architecture was revealed. The sentinel trees, the great oaks and ancient beeches, became the silent keepers of the season, their forms holding a different kind of lesson. Without their leaves, they were stark etchings against the gray sky, an intricate map of branching decisions. Their bark, dark with wet or patched with pale lichen, seemed more pronounced. They did not fight the winter. They endured it through a profound stillness. Their sap had retreated to their deep roots, Their life slowed to an imperceptible pulse. They were monuments to patience. To the peasant looking out from the village edge, these trees offered a strange comfort. Their permanence was a reassurance. The same tree that had cast shade on a great-grandfather's sheep was there now, holding its ground against the same wind. Its bare branches cradled the snow in artistic drifts, then released it in soft showers when the sun touched them. In the fiercest gales, they bent and groaned, speaking a language of strain and resilience that anyone who had weathered a storm in a thatched house could understand. These trees were also the village's memory. The notched oak marked the boundary of the common land. The lightning-scarred beech was where the old path turned toward the river. They were landmarks in a white, featureless world. More than that, they were a promise. The tight, hard buds clenched at the end of every twig were not just buds. They were sealed vaults containing the entire concept of spring, the leaf, the flower, the acorn. They were proof that life was not gone, but compact, waiting. The forest in winter was not friendly, but its eldest trees were neutral, wise presences. They had seen countless winters harder than this one. Chapter 29. The Names of the Cold. A Language of Frost. Winter was not a single thing, but a multitude of states, each with its own character, its own dangers, and its own name. The language of the medieval peasant held a rich and precise vocabulary for the cold, a lexicon born of intimate observation and necessity. To name a thing was to begin to understand it, to know how to meet it. There was the rhyme. This was the hard, granular frost that feathered the edges of every leaf and blade of grass on still, clear nights, a frozen breath from the earth itself. It was beautiful and brittle, vanishing with the first touch of sun. Then came the hoarfrost, heavier and more profound. It coated the world in thick, crystalline fur, turning fences into white serpents and thatch into cakes of icing. It spoke of deep, pervasive dampness frozen in place, and it often presaged a day of iron-hard ground. A black frost was the most feared. It left no white beauty in its wake. It was a pure, dry cold so intense it froze the earth solid to a great depth, killing the roots of winter wheat and making the ground ring like stone underfoot. It was a killing frost, silent and invisible. The thaw, too, had its names. A false thaw was a brief, cruel respite that melted the surface snow only to refreeze it overnight into a sheet of treacherous ice. A generous thaw was a steady, gradual softening from the south, the kind that filled the ditches with chuckling water and bared patches of dark, hopeful earth. They spoke of the wolf's frost, the clear, bright cold of deep January that made the stars snap like sparks in the sky and brought the wolves closer to the village in their desperate hunger. They knew the hag's breath, a sudden, icy wind that swept down from the hills with no warning, seeping through the smallest chink in the wall. This language did more than describe. It advised. Hearing that a black frost had set in meant bringing extra fodder to the livestock, as the frozen ground. Chapter 30. The Final Accounting. Facing the Empty Sack. There came a day, often when the first true green was still a promise and not a fact, when the careful arithmetic of winter reached its final sum. This was the moment of the empty sack. The last measured handful of grain was poured into the quern to be ground. The final rock-hard turnip was pulled from the straw of the clamp, soft at its core. The salt barrel held only a crust at the bottom. The winter as a storehouse was now officially spent. This moment carried a profound, quiet gravity. It was not necessarily a moment of panic, for it was anticipated in the very bones of their planning. But it was a threshold. The period of living on the accumulated labor of autumn was over. Now they lived on anticipation alone. The body, already lean, would grow leaner. The pottage became little more than hot water flavored with a memory of peas and a few wild greens scavenged from the forest's edge where the snow had retreated. This was the hungry gap in its most acute form, the bare ledge between the end of the old and the beginning of the new. All attention now turned outward, with a desperate intensity. Eyes scanned the fields not for beauty, but for the faintest haze of green where the winter wheat might be stirring. The forest was scoured not just for wood, but for the first edible shoots, nettles, dock leaves, anything that could boil into a vaguely nourishing gruel. Birds' nests were checked for eggs with a new urgency. Every activity became a search for calories. This was the final, starkest test of their autumn's judgment. Had they stored enough? Had they rationed wisely? A family that faced the empty sack a full month before the first harvest was in dire peril. One that met it just a week or two before the land yielded was a family that had calculated perfectly. This period forged a mindset of extreme frugality that would linger even into abundance, a hesitation to waste a single crumb that would mark. Chapter 31. The Weaver of Tales. Story as Sustenance. When the wood burned low and the night pressed its black face against the shutters, a different kind of nourishment was shared. The physical stores in the cellar could feed the body, but the long darkness threatened the spirit. Against this, they wielded a different kind of preservation, the story. In the flickering hearthlight, the weaver of tales, often a grandparent or a traveler with a memory for detail, would begin to spin a thread far more intricate than wool. These were not short tales. They were epic, rambling narratives that unfolded over nights, even weeks. They told of clever peasants and proud lords, of saints and demons walking the very roads they knew, of fairy rings in the local forest and ghosts in the standing stones on the hill. The stories were layered with practical knowledge. The description of a hero forging a sword contained the precise steps of the blacksmith's art. A quest through a treacherous swamp mirrored the very real dangers of the peat bogs nearby. The tales served as a neural larder, storing vital information in a form that could not freeze or rot. They taught morality, history, and survival strategy wrapped in the captivating cloak of adventure. For children listening, wide-eyed, they explained the shape of the world and their place in it. For adults, they offered a mental escape from the confines of the single smoky room, a journey across imaginary landscapes when the real one was locked in ice. The rhythm of the telling was as slow and measured as the season itself. Details were lavished upon the description of a feast, drawing out the listener's hunger only to satisfy it in imagination. The tension of a monster's approach was stretched taut over a quarter hour, making the final victory a shared relief. This was not entertainment to pass time, but sustenance to fill it, to give the long, empty hours a shape and a purpose. In this way, the story became as vital as the hearer. Chapter 32. The Marking of Time. Candles and Shadows. In a season where the sun was a pale, brief guest, the measurement of time slipped its celestial moorings. The sundial was useless, buried in snow or casting no shadow under the endless gray dome. Instead, time became a domestic, intimate thing, measured by consumption and the slow dance of artificial light. The primary clock was the candle. A household might have a stock of tallow dips, made from rendered animal fat, or the rarer, cleaner-burning beeswax candles saved for the darkest days. The life of a candle was a known quantity. It marked the evening hours not in abstract concepts, but in inches of wax consumed. I mended the harness by a half-candle's light, one might say, or the child's fever broke late, just as the first candle guttered out. Time was also measured in tasks, each with its expected duration. It takes the time of splitting 3 good logs to walk to the mill and back on the ice. They knew. The slow simmering of the day's pottage was a kitchen clock. The length of a story told by the fire was another. But the most patient timepiece was the shadow on the wall. As a rushlight or candle burned, its flame would dance, and the shadows of those seated around it would stretch and shrink in a slow, silent ballet. A person could watch their own shadow grow tall and thin, then sink down as the night wore on and the fuel was consumed. The very architecture of the room became a sundial for the night, with the moving shadow of a roof beam or a hanging pot tracing an arc against the daub wall. This method of marking time created a different relationship with its passage. It was not linear and relentless, but granular and finite. You could see your light, your fuel, your evening, literally diminishing before your eyes. It fostered a deep, conscious economy of time. There was no wasting an hour. There was only using the light you had wisely. When the final light was doused and the true dark of. Chapter 33. The Wind's Counsel. Listening to the weather. In a world without glass windows, the weather was not something observed at a distance. It was an intimate, audible presence, a constant conversation against the walls and roof. To survive the winter, one did not merely endure the wind. One learned to listen to it. Its voice, changing with direction and temperature, became the village's most vital and ominous broadcast. A wind from the north or east spoke a clear, sharp language. It was a dry wind, whistling through chinks in the stone with a high, thin keen. It carried the smell of frozen pine and distant ice fields. This wind counseled hunkering down. It meant a black frost was coming, a cold that would seize the earth in its iron grip. It was a warning to bring extra wood inside, to ensure the animals were snug, to brace for a night where the very stars seemed to crackle with cold. A wind from the south or west brought a different message. It was a softer, wetter voice, murmuring against the thatch. It carried the scent of damp earth and, sometimes, the distant salt tang of the sea. This wind spoke of change, of thaw. But it was a sly counselor. It could bring a false thaw, a treacherous softening followed by a lethal refreeze. It could also bring the sleet that was worse than snow, a soaking, icy rain that penetrated wool and brought a chill to the very marrow. The silence of the wind, however, could be the most telling voice of all. A still, heavy quiet often meant snow was gathering itself to fall, a thick, muffling blanket about to descend. A sudden cessation of a howling gale might mean the eye of a storm was passing over, a brief, eerie respite before the tempest returned from the opposite quarter. They learned the house's specific songs. A particular moan from the roof beam meant a storm driving in from the moor. A certain rattle of the shutter announced a wind that would find its way down the smoke hole and send ashes swirling. This listen. Chapter 34. The burden of wool. The weight of warmth. The winter wardrobe was not a matter of fashion, but of physics. To step outside was to layer oneself in a portable shelter, and the primary material of that shelter was wool. It was a magnificent insulator, but its warmth came at a cost. The medieval peasant did not simply wear wool. They carried its considerable weight upon their person, a daily burden that was the price of survival. The foundation was the tunic and breeches, woven from coarse, thick wool, often still holding some of the animal's lanolin, which helped shed water. Over this came layers, a heavier overtunic, a cloak fastened at the shoulder with a pin or brooch. In the deepest cold, multiple tunics might be worn. Each garment was dense. When soaked by sleet or melted snow, it could become crushingly heavy, the fibers holding the icy water like a sponge. This weight shaped movement. Labor was slower, more deliberate. The simple act of bending to gather firewood or to check an animal's hoof required moving against the resistance of one's own clothing. It was an exhausting kind of warmth. One did not run in a winter cloak. One trudged. The swaddling of infants and small children was especially meticulous, turning them into near-immobile bundles, their warmth preserved at the expense of all mobility. And there was the itch. The finest, softest wools were for the nobility. The peasant's wool was often scratchy, harsh against the skin, especially at the neck and wrists. It could chafe and irritate, a constant, low-grade discomfort that was simply part of the season's texture. Lice found the dense, unwashed layers a perfect habitat, adding their own tiny, crawling misery to the burden. Yet, to don these heavy garments each morning was an act of profound gratitude. The weight meant security. It was the tangible result of a year's labor. The shearing, the cleaning, the spinning, the weaving, the sewing. Each thread represented hours of work by the F. Chapter 36. The unseen network. The dependence on others. A peasant household in winter appeared, from the outside, to be a sealed and self-sufficient unit. Smoke rose from its own roof. Its stores were within its own walls. Its family huddled around its own fire. But this was an illusion of the snow. Survival was woven through a vast, fragile, and mostly unseen network of dependencies that the harsh season pulled taut. The blacksmith held a key link. A broken plowshare in spring was an inconvenience. A broken axe head in winter, with wood to chop for survival, was a crisis. His skill and his fire were a communal resource. His labor exchanged for grain, a chicken, or future work. The miller, too, was vital. A family's private quern could grind meal, But for the fine flour needed for better bread, or to process large quantities, the mill's great stones, turned by water or wind, were essential. His service was paid for in a portion of the grain, a tax on survival itself. There was the wise woman or barber surgeon, the keeper of practical medicine. When a cough deepened or a wound festered, their knowledge of herbs and procedures was the only wall between a household and disaster. Their payment might be in wool, eggs, or labor. And then there were the neighbors. This network was the most subtle and most critical. It was the shared glance that meant extra firewood would be left by a door for an elderly couple. It was the unspoken understanding that a missing ewe would be searched for by all. It was the borrowing of a sieve, the lending of a lamp, the collective effort to clear a snow-choked lane. This economy of mutual aid required a deep, unshakable trust, for everyone's vulnerability was equal. This network was silent. No ledgers were kept for most of it. The accounts were stored in collective memory and a sense of honor. To be a bad neighbor, to hoard, to cheat, to refuse aid was not just a moral failing. It was a direct threat to the structural integrity of. Chapter 35. The Philosophy of the Hearth. Embracing the stillness. The relentless drive of the agrarian year, the plowing, sowing, weeding, reaping, came to an absolute halt. Winter imposed a cessation that was not of their choosing, but from which a certain wisdom could be wrested. This was not idleness, but a different state of being, the philosophy of the hearth. It was the understanding that survival sometimes meant not striving, but staying. Not expanding, but conserving. Not speaking, but listening. The hearth taught the value of the small sphere. One's world shrank to the distance a voice could carry across a room, to the circle of light cast by a single flame. In that contraction, details became magnified. The grain of the wooden bowl in one's hands, the play of shadow on a child's face as they listened to a story, the exact sound of the different woods burning. Oak's steady hiss, pine's brisk crackle. A depth of attention was cultivated that the frantic scatter of summer did not allow. It taught the discipline of sufficiency. The goal was not to be warm, but to be not cold. Not to be full, but to be not hungry. The satisfaction was in the precise meeting of a need, not in its excess. A single, well-stewed turnip shared among a family could be a quiet triumph. The heat from a single well-chosen log, burning slowly and completely, was a lesson in efficiency. This stillness also bred a profound internal resilience. With the outside world locked away, the only frontiers were those of the mind and spirit. Patience was not a virtue but a practiced skill, built hour by hour in the dim light. Reflection became inevitable. One took stock not only of the remaining stores, but of the year past, of relationships, of one's own strengths and failures. The winter hearth was a confessional of sorts, a place for an unspoken audit of the soul. The philosophy of the hearth was, in the end, an acceptance of rhythm. It was the acknowledgement that life was not a constant CR. Chapter 38. The Color of Winter. A world reduced to essence. The palette of summer was a riot they could barely recall. The impossible green of new beech leaves, the gold of wheat, the blue of cornflowers, the red of poppies. Winter stripped all that away, not to gray, but to a stark and profound spectrum of essence. It was a world rendered in mineral and bone, in the fundamental colors of the earth itself. The dominant color was white, but it was a white of infinite variation. There was the blinding, sun-struck white of fresh snow on open ground, the softer, blue-white of snow in shadow, the grubby, gray-white of trodden paths and village centers, the brittle, crystalline white of hoarfrost feathered on a black branch. Against this white stood black, the black of wet, bare branches against a leaden sky, the black of crows wheeling over the fields, the deep, rich black of fertile soil revealed in a sudden thaw-patch, a shocking visual promise, the sooty black of the interior thatch above the hearth, a record of every fire burned. And then there was brown. This was the most varied and vital color of all. The silver brown of old bracken in the wood. The warm, reddish brown of a fox's pelt glimpsed at the forest edge. The dark, wet brown of woolen cloaks steaming by the fire. the pale, dry brown of stored reeds and straw, the rich, almost edible brown of a loaf of rye bread. Brown was the color of resource, of things that persisted, of tools and clothing and the very timbers of the house. Glimpses of other hues were events. The flash of green from a holly berry's leaf, the sudden red of a robin's breast against the snow, a heartbeat of color that could make a child gasp, the dull gold of rushlight, or the amber of precious honey in a crock. These were not mere colors. They were messages, jewels in the monotony. Living within this reduced palette-sharpened perception, the eye learned to read meaning in subtle shifts. The blue tinge to the snow at dusk meant a brew. Chapter 37. The Children's Winter. A season of diminished light. For the children, winter was a world remade, its boundaries drawn by the hearthstone and the limit of a mother's call through the cold air. The vast, sun-drenched playground of summer. The fields, the streams, the forests, contracted into a small, dim domain. Their experience of the season was one of profound interiority, a slow-burning lesson in patience conducted in half-light. The exuberant energy of youth was forced to turn inward, to find expression in small, quiet things. There were toys, of course, a whittled top, a doll of straw and rag, a set of knucklebones. But mostly there was observation. They became students of the hearthlight, watching the shapes of flames and the stories they seemed to tell on the sooty back wall. They listened, truly listened, to the tales of their elders, the narratives weaving a wider world in the close air. They learned the crafts of survival not through lecture, but through osmosis, the rhythm of the spindle, the stitch of a mend, the careful banking of the coals. Outdoors, play was brief and muffled. Snow might offer a day's novelty, the packing of a rough snowball, the making of a simple shape, but the cold bit quickly through thin clothing, driving them back to the door. They became tasked with the small, vital errands of the season, carrying a measured handful of grain to the hen coop, fetching a specific log from the pile, watching a younger sibling to keep them from the fire's edge. These were not chores, but dignities, their first official contributions to the household's fortress against the cold. But winter also pressed upon them its harder truths. They felt the increasing thinness of the pottage. They witnessed the anxiety in a parent's face when the wind howled from the north. The illness of a sibling or grandparent filled the house with a silent dread they could feel, even if they did not fully understand. The concept of scarcity became personal. Chapter 40. The Geography of Warmth. Mapping the hearth's kingdom. Within the confines of the winter home, space was not democratic. It was a strict hierarchy governed by a single, immutable law: proximity to the hearth. The house was not one room, but a series of concentric rings of diminishing comfort, a tiny kingdom with a fiery sovereign at its heart. The inner circle was the dominion of the hearth itself and the immediate stones around it. This was the place of highest honor and greatest need. Here sat the elder storyteller, the nursing mother, the child recovering from fever. Here the cook commanded the pot. To have a seat in this ring was to be at the center of the world's warmth and its social life. The heat here was direct, often fierce on the face while the back remained chilled. Beyond this lay the middle ground, a zone of variable and negotiated comfort. Here the heat was radiant, not direct. It was the space for mending, for spinning, for quiet conversation. One had to turn a shoulder to the fire to feel it evenly. This was where most of the waking hours were spent, in a state of managed warmth, close enough to benefit, far enough to avoid the spit and spark. Drafts from the door or shutters made their presence known here, creating cold spots that shifted with the wind. Then came the outer reaches, the shadowlands of the home. The corners, the space near the door, the area where the bed platform met the cold outer wall. Here the cold held sway. Stored goods might freeze here. Breath fogged visibly. This was the territory of last resort, where one slept if the family was large, or where one passed quickly on the way to the privy or the byre. The warmth here was a rumor, a faint memory carried on the damp, smoky air. This geography dictated the daily and nightly rituals. At mealtimes, the family would crowd into the inner rings, then disperse. At night, the strongest or lowest status members might take the outer edge sleeping spots, their bodies. Chapter 39. The Animal's Wisdom. Instincts in the Stable and Field. The people were not the only ones who understood the turning of the year. In the byre and the stable, in the hen coop and the woods beyond, the animals lived their own profound and silent winter. Their instincts, sharpened by an existence without fire or stored grain, offered a different kind of lesson in survival, one of pure, unthinking adaptation. The cattle and sheep grew thick, shaggy coats, a biological response no human weaving could match. They stood close in their stalls, sharing body heat, turning their backs to the prevailing wind. Their metabolism slowed. They moved less, conserving every ounce of energy gleaned from the precious hay. A wise herdsman knew to listen to them. If they were restless for no reason, it often meant a storm was coming, their senses detecting a drop in pressure invisible to humans. The horses, those engines of summer labor, stood in a patient, steaming quiet. Their great strength was dormant. They were groomed not for shine, but for health, the currycomb loosening the dead undercoat to allow better insulation. Their breath hung in the air, a visible sign of the life burning within to maintain their immense body heat, a furnace that consumed fodder at an alarming rate. In the hen coop, the laying ceased or slowed to a rare, treasured egg. The bird's energy went not into production, but into simple maintenance of life. They fluffed their feathers into downy balls, trapping warm air against their skin, and huddled together on the roost in a feathered mound of shared warmth. But the most instructive wisdom came from observing the wild things. The hare's fur turned white, not for beauty, for invisibility. The squirrel's frantic autumn caching was a mirror of the human harvest, but driven by a pulse they could not ignore. The birds that did not flee, the sparrows, the crows, became bold and desperate, venturing closer to the midden heaps and barn doors, a lesson in Op. Chapter 41. The Sound of Hunger. The belly's hollow drum. As the weeks wore on, a new sound entered the symphony of the winter household. It was not the crackle of the fire, nor the whisper of the spindle, nor the moan of the wind. It was a low, internal rumble, a hollow gurgle that spoke not of sickness, but of simple, profound emptiness. This was the sound of hunger, the belly's insistent drum, beating time through the long, lean afternoons. At first, it was an occasional, private complaint, masked by movement or conversation. But as the stores dwindled and the pottage grew clearer, it became a shared, unspoken chorus. It was heard in the quiet moment after a meager meal, as bodies assessed the scant fuel they'd been given. It was the sound that filled the silence when the storytelling paused. Children's bellies were most vocal, their small bodies with less reserve, their needs more biologically blunt. The sound shaped behavior. It made hands move more slowly, conserving energy. It shortened tempers and lengthened looks toward the storage barrels. It turned the act of eating the daily bread into a focused, deliberate ritual, each small bite chewed until it was nearly liquid, extracting every possible gram of nourishment. The gnawing emptiness was a constant, dull companion, a physical reminder of the arithmetic of the larder. Yet, within this shared deprivation, there was also a strange discipline. The sound of hunger was a teacher. It taught the true value of a crust, the miracle of fat, the deep gratitude for a handful of nuts found still cached in a corner of the loft. It made the memory of autumn's fullness not a taunt, but a sacred promise to be better prepared next time. They learned to listen to it not with panic, but with a weary respect. It was the body's honest report, a meter measuring the distance until the next scant meal. In the depth of winter, to be entirely without that hollow sound was a luxury unknown. Its presence meant they were still be. Chapter 42. The Illusion of Spring. The cruelest week. Just when endurance was at its thinnest, winter could play its most vicious trick. A wind would turn, carrying a whisper from the south. The sun, for 2 or 3 days, would gain a strength it had not held in months. The snow would shrink back from the bases of trees with startling speed, revealing patches of dark, steaming earth. Birds would sing with a tentative optimism. This was the illusion of spring, A fleeting, beautiful lie that was often the cruelest week of the year. Hearts, so carefully guarded against hope, would inevitably lift. Heavy doors were left ajar to let in the unaccustomed mild air. Winter cloaks were set aside for lighter tunics. Thoughts turned dangerously to the future, to the repair of fences, to the scent of turned soil. It was a psychological thaw more potent than the physical one, a draining of the deep resilience they had stored up. And then, with the swiftness of a falling axe, it would end. The wind would shear back to the north, bitter and final. The temperature would plummet, not to the familiar deep cold, but to a wet, penetrating chill that seeped into bones already convinced they were safe. The melted snow would refreeze overnight into a sheet of black, treacherous ice over everything. The hopeful buds on the fruit trees, tricked into swelling, would be flash-frozen and killed, dooming a season's harvest in a single night. The return to the winter routine after this betrayal was a profound misery. The hearth fire, banked low during the warm spell, now seemed a feeble defense. The thick cloaks felt heavier, their weight a rebuke. The memory of the sun's false warmth made the smoky interior seem more confined, more oppressive. This was the moment when morale could truly fracture, when the long burden felt longest, because hope had been offered and then snatched away with a smirk. This cruel week served as winter's final, stern lesson. It taught the folly of anticipation. Chapter 44. The Night Watch, Vigil Against the Unseen. When the last ember was banked and the final body had settled into the rustling straw of the shared bed, the house did not fully sleep. Part of it remained on duty. This was the Night Watch, a state of semi-conscious vigilance maintained by everyone, but most acutely by the head of the household or the lightest sleeper. It was a guard kept not against human thieves, but against the unseen threats that the long, frozen night could unleash. The ears were the primary sentinels. They listened through the layers of sleep for the wrong sound. The scuttle of a rat in the grain store was an alarm, a threat to the food itself. The sudden silence of the wind could be more ominous than its howl, often meaning a heavy snowfall was blocking the smoke hole, a danger of smoke inhalation or, worse, a choked fire. They listened to the animals. A restless lowing from the byre, a frantic clucking from the hen coop, could mean a fox had found a way in, or that damp had given a cow the tremors. A dog's low growl from the hearthside was a report from the perimeter. But the most dreaded sound was no sound at all from a child or an elder. A cessation of the soft, rhythmic breath that meant all was well. The night watch would then stir, a hand extended in the absolute dark to feel for warmth, for the rise and fall of a chest. This vigil was exhausting. It fractured sleep into shallow layers. It meant waking with a start to the bang of a loose shutter, heart pounding, before logic identified the noise. It was the reason the axe and the bucket of water were always by the door, one for a predator, the other for a stray spark. This shared, unspoken watch was a testament to their vulnerability. Their safety was a fragile construct of thatch, timber, and trust in the banked fire. The night was vast, and they were small within it. The night watch was the mind's stubborn refusal to fully surrender to the dark, a silent promise to the slee. Chapter 43. The Arithmetic of Wood, Fuel as Fortune. In winter, a family's wealth was not counted in coin, but in cordwood. The stack against the house was a more accurate ledger than any parchment, a visible measure of security and foresight. The consumption of wood was the most relentless arithmetic of the season, a subtraction that could not be reversed. Each log carried to the hearth was a small fortune spent. The careful householder knew the value of each species. Oak and ash were the gold standard, dense, slow-burning, holding a deep bed of coals that radiated heat for hours. They were for the long nights, for banking the fire to survive till dawn. Birch burned bright and fast, with a cheerful flame, good for quick cooking or taking the raw edge off a cold morning. Pine and fir, full of resin, were the tinder and kindling, the sparks that woke the heavier woods, but they burned too quickly to trust for the main fire. Gathering was a relentless, cold task. Deadfall from the Lord's forest was a rite, but it required hauling. Fallen branches were collected from the margins of fields. Every piece, no matter how gnarled or rotten at the core, had potential. The work of splitting and stacking was autumnal labor, but in winter, the pile was a fortress wall that was under constant siege. The management of the fire was an exercise in thrift. A log was not simply thrown on. It was positioned to catch properly, to burn completely to ash. The size of the fire was dictated by the task: a tiny, focused flame for mending a harness, a broader bed for simmering the pot. At night, the art of banking was a precise science. Enough fuel to keep the embers alive, but not so much as to be wastefully consumed before morning. To run low was a slow-burning crisis. It meant burning green wood that hissed and smoked and gave little heat. It meant sending someone out into a storm to forage for anything burnable: peat, dried dung, the very bark from the trees. A dwindling woodpile cast. Chapter 45. The Gift of Darkness. The Invention of Rest. We think of winter as a time of hardship, and so it was. But within that hardship, buried like a seed in frozen ground, was an unintended gift. The gift of enforced rest. The medieval laborer knew no weekend, no vacation. From dawn to dusk in the growing seasons, the body was a tool bent to the will of sun and soil. Only winter brought the pardon. The darkness itself was the warden of this rest. With light so scarce, outdoor work was impossible for much of the day. The body, accustomed to constant demand, was forced to still itself. Aches from old injuries, ignored during the harvest, had time to whisper their complaints and then slowly quiet. Hands calloused from the scythe and plow softened slightly, the cracks healing. It was a deep cellular reprieve. This rest was not idleness. It was a different kind of work, the work of maintenance rather than production. It was the meticulous, slow repair of tools. It was the patient spinning of wool, a rhythmic, undemanding motion that soothed rather than strained. It allowed for the long, meandering story, the considered conversation, the teaching of a craft to a child without the frantic pressure of the next chore. In this slowed down time, the mind, too, found a space it never had in summer. There was room for reflection, for memory, for a kind of mental wandering that was impossible when every thought was directed at the task at hand. The imagination, fueled by the storyteller's tales, built its own interior landscapes. This mental rest was as vital as the physical. It prevented the spirit from becoming merely another worn-out tool. Winter, therefore, secretly sculpted their humanity. The relentless outdoor labor of summer built strength and endurance. But the inward, quiet labor of winter built patience, depth, and culture. It forged the family bond in shared stillness. It allowed for the transmission of lore, for the creation of songs, for the simple pro. Chapter 46. The Language of the Sky. Reading the clouds. In a world without forecast, the sky was the only scripture that predicted the morrow. To survive the winter's caprice, one had to become literate in the language of clouds, in the tones of light, in the silent portents written on the dome of the world. This was not meteorology as science, but as a vital, practiced art of divination. A mackerel sky, high, rippled clouds like fish scales, was a trusted herald. It spoke of change, often of a coming warm front that could bring the dreaded sleet or a false thaw. It was a sky that advised caution, to not be fooled by a milder morning. A halo around the moon, a pale, luminous ring, was an ancient and certain text. It was caused by ice crystals in high, thin clouds, and it almost always foretold snowfall within a day or two. It was a warning to finish outdoor tasks, to ensure the wood was close to hand. The color of the sunset was a nightly oracle. A pale, watery yellow sunset often meant continued cold. But a clear, greenish sky at dusk was said to portend fair weather, a rare and hopeful sign. A red sky in the morning, however, was a shepherd's warning known to all. Snow or storm was likely on its way. But the most profound reading was of the quality of the silence on a clear, very cold day. A certain hard, brittle blue in the sky, accompanied by a total stillness, meant a black frost was coming. A cold so intense it would seize the land in a silent, iron grip. This sky offered no clouds to interpret, only an absence that was, itself, the most severe message of all. This literacy was communal and passed down. A father would point out the mare's tails streaming high, predicting wind. A grandmother would note the low, flat anvil of a cloud on the horizon and urge the laundry be brought in swiftly. Misreading the sky could mean a lost flock, a ruined journey, a night spent in desperate cold. To look up was therefore an act of survival. The sky was a living park. Chapter 47. The Fragility of Flame, the Psychology of Light. In a season defined by the early fall of darkness, the psychology of light was as crucial as the physics of warmth. The flame, whether from a costly candle, a smoky rushlight, or the hearth itself, was not merely a source of illumination. It was a psychological anchor, a tiny, defiant assertion of order against the formless, consuming dark. The gradual dimming of the afternoon was a daily, gentle siege. As the gray light at the window faded to black, a specific anxiety crept in. This was the moment for the lighting of the lamp. The strike of flint on steel, the nurturing of the first spark in tinder, was a ritual of profound importance. Failure here meant not just darkness, but a palpable step backward into primal vulnerability. The moment the small flame caught and steadied was a moment of collective, unspoken relief. The quality of light dictated mood and possibility. The hearth fire offered a lively, dancing light that painted moving shadows on the walls, suitable for sociability, for storytelling, for the busywork of hands. The steady glow of a good tallow candle allowed for finer work, the mending of a net, the carving of a spoon, the learning of letters by a child of a wealthy family. The guttering, stinking light of a rushlight, made from a peeled reed dipped in fat, was a light of last resort, a grudging concession to necessity that produced more shadow than illumination, straining the eyes and the spirit. To conserve light was to conserve sanity. Tasks were ordered by it. Fine work done during the precious daylight, communal or coarse work by the firelight, rest in the deep dark. The decision to light a second candle was a serious one, a luxury that spoke of either dire need or rare celebration. This intimate dependence bred a reverence for light that bordered on the sacred. The Yule log, chosen with care and lit from the preserved ember of the previous year's fire, was not just fuel. It was a Chapter 48. The Hidden Harvest. Gleaning the Barren World. By late winter, the formal stores were echoes. The granary's song was a faint rustle. The salt meat was a memory of flavor. This was the time for the hidden harvest, a desperate, ingenious foraging from a world that appeared utterly spent. It was the season of gleaning not from fields, but from the very edges of existence, where life clung in dormant, unexpected forms. The forest's floor, now partly clear of snow, was scoured not for mushrooms, but for lichen. Certain varieties, scraped from north-facing rocks, could be boiled for hours to produce a thin, gelatinous, bitter broth. It was starvation food, hard on the belly, but it contained calories where there otherwise were none. Tree bark, specifically the soft, inner cambium layer of pine, elm, or birch, was carefully peeled from the south side of living trees. This was a last resort, damaging to the tree and a crime on the Lord's land if caught. It was dried, pounded into a coarse, fibrous flour, and mixed with the last dusty scrapings of true grain to make a bread that was more filler than nourishment. The river's edge yielded a different treasure. Frozen cattail roots, painstakingly dug from the half-frozen muck, could be pounded to release a starchy pulp. It was a filthy, cold labor for a meager return. Even the village itself became a foraging ground. The thatch of old roofs, being replaced, might hold forgotten nests with traces of grain or seeds. The midden heap, the communal rubbish pile, was picked over with a new intensity, not for trash, but for anything organic that had been discarded in richer times. A rotten apple core, a gnawed bone to boil yet again. This hidden harvest was a testament to human desperation and botanical knowledge. It was knowledge passed in whispers, the lore of the truly hungry. It was work that yielded little, but that little could be the difference. A broth of lichen and a cake of bark flour could stretch a family. Chapter 49. The Unbreaking Circle. The Wisdom of the Elders. In the dimness of the winter home, the eldest members of the family held a place of quiet, central gravity. Their labor in the fields was done, their strength for hauling wood was past. But winter was the season when their true currency appreciated. the currency of memory and weathered wisdom. They were the keepers of the unbreaking circle, the living bridge between the present hardship and every winter that had come before. Their hands, knotted with arthritis, were now guides for younger fingers, showing the precise angle to hold a knife for peeling bark flour, the exact stitch to darn wool so it would not chafe, the proper way to bank different types of wood ash for lye making in the spring. Their knowledge was not theoretical. It was tactile, earned through decades of seasons. They were the librarians of survival. They remembered the great winter of 50 years prior, how the ice had lain on the ground until May, and what the family had done to survive. They recalled which stands of trees had the best deadfall after a particular storm, which hidden patch of land always saw the first green shoots of sorrel. They held the recipes for the most desperate poultices and the stories that were long enough to span a week of nights. Perhaps most importantly, they were the stewards of perspective. When the parents fretted over the dwindling grain, the elder would nod slowly and say, "I have seen the barrel lower than this. The thaw is in the wind. I can feel it in my bones." Their calm was a bulwark against panic. They had witnessed the cycle turn, time and again. Their very presence was proof that this too would pass. In the long, silent hours, they were the weavers of identity. To a grandchild on their lap, they would trace the family lineage, tell of an ancestor who had built this very hearthstone, of another who had bargained wisely with a traveling merchant for the seed grain that saved them. They root. Chapter 50. The Turning Point. Sap and the First True Thaw. The final, reliable sign was not seen, but heard, and then tasted. It began with a new, soft percussive sound joining the drip from the eaves. It was the patter of sap, falling from 100,000 tiny wounds in the maple and birch branches, hitting the last crust of snow below with a sound like distant, gentle rain. This was the turning point. The earth was not just melting, it was rising. The first true thaw had a different character from the false ones. It was patient. It did not roar. It seeped. The ground, frozen solid to the depth of a man's leg, began to give up its frost from the top down. A shovel, which had previously rung against iron-hard earth, now bit in with a soggy crunch. The smell was the most profound signal. The rich, cold, fertile scent of wet soil and rotting leaves, a scent so potent after months of sterile ice smell that it felt like a physical awakening. This was the moment when waiting became preparation. The psychology of the household shifted irrevocably. Eyes that had been turned inward to the hearth now looked outward with calculation. The seed corn, those precious, hard kernels saved from the last harvest and guarded like jewels, was brought out for inspection. Fingers tested them for firmness, for the life within. Men walked the boundaries of their strips in the common field, not yet to work, but to assess. They noted where the snow lay longest, where the drainage would be poor. They felt the heft of their plowshares, newly mended at the smithy, and imagined the first friction of the sod turning over. The animals felt it, too. The cow's milk, which had been a trickle, showed a faint increase. The hens, sensing the lengthening light, might produce an egg a week instead of none. Life was not yet abundant, but it was undeniably, irreversibly present. This was the cusp. The harsh arithmetic of subtraction was over. Now began the slower, wetter, muddier calculus of add.